Okay, thank you. And last panel for the day, we are almost done. I will try to bring some energy, hence I'm standing up. So I am gonna speak today as a historian of linguistics, and the overarching point that I'd like to make is that through recourse to, or the point I'd like to make through recourse to a fairly wacky case study is that when looking at linguistic studies and linguistic projects of the past, we're forced to acknowledge that some of the basic tenets and assumptions that we in the 21st century take as given are not, in fact, givens. And I'd like to contend that familiarizing ourselves with different kinds of linguistic thinking from different periods and contexts has the potential to expand our thinking in profitable ways. So one such given is that the fully realized writing system is one that is standard or normative. That writing systems have, in other words, a standard spelling. One can diverge from the standard for various reasons, but we accept that, unlike for spoken language, where there can be enormous dialectical diversity, the writing systems associated with a given language will have at least one standard, and that is a desirable, perhaps an inevitable state of affairs. This was, of course, what Miletus was speaking about yesterday. And in the case of English, you may be acquainted with a potted history whereby standard spelling, such as it is, arose over the course of the 17th century. And any individual who has spoken out with an eye for adjusting those spellings or those spelling conventions is labeled a spelling reformer. And those reform projects, when discussed in scholarly literature, are usually categorized into a single typology according to their approach and strategies. Now, I'm going to be talking today about John Hart, a so-called English spelling reformer who worked in the third quarter of the 16th century. And what I'd like to suggest is that the moniker spelling reformer, and in fact the word spelling, are completely anachronistic to this context. Not because Hart and his project predated the rise of standard spelling in English, which is itself a very complicated and misleading statement, because it's not as if English went from total chaos to a neat and tidy standard. The reason why calling Hart a spelling reformer is anachronistic is because the spelling part of Hart's reform was only a subsidiary part of what he was doing as a whole. The term that I would suggest we use instead is orthographic reform. Early modern orthographic reformers, if you will, don't use the word spelling, which in this period means something quite different from what it means today. They instead describe their systems as new or reformed or true orthographies. And the word orthography means a writing system in its entirety, encompassing not only spelling in the modern sense, but also letter forms, script, font, style, punctuation, capitalization. This is what they mean with the word orthography. None of the orthographic reformers were much fussed by our idea of a standard spelling. What they wanted instead was an improved form of English, an improved form of the English vernacular that would be worthy of and that would improve upon the English nation as a whole and that would hold up against continental counterparts. I'm confining this talk to Hart, mainly for rhetorical reasons, among others, but I could make similar claims of his contemporaries. So Sir Thomas Smith, William Bullock Carr, Richard Mulcaster, Gill, Butler. Scholarly literature casts all of these early modern figures as spelling reformers, which really obfuscates the scale of what it is that they're actually proposing. So John Hart tried 3 times to reshape English orthography. The first, so that it looked something like this, which is secretary hand with a twist. The second, so that it looked like this. And the third time, like this. Now, John Hart is not a household name, but those of you who may be familiar with him likely know him as one of the first and most sophisticated phonologists of England. His work has been mined by scholars for 2 things in particular. First, his robust descriptions of English phonemes, and second, for the texts that he writes in his reformed orthographies, which scholars have taken as a transcription of speech and used to help reconstruct historical pronunciations of English. Just to give a quick sense of his phonetic contributions, here is one of his more precious descriptions of a sound for the letter H. So he says, "We abuse the name of H, calling it H, which sound serveth very well to express a headache or some bone ache, but whose property is to signify only the breath, without any mean of instrument or sound." And he goes on, "As when we laugh, we bring out our breath, so ha, 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 or he, 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 where the H hath no sound, but as you would blow to warm your hands." This is not an overly technical definition, and the terminology that he uses is now obsolete. But take it from me, you'll be hard put to find more detailed descriptions of any speech sound for 100 years to come. And what's really special about Hart is that he combines these visceral descriptions of sounds with an overarching phonetic theory that is not too dissimilar from modern phonetics. Without using today's jargon, he discusses voiced and voiceless pairs, allophones, sondy, prosody, really impressive stuff, and with very little intellectual precedent. Now, the reason why Hart performed his phonetic analysis of English, sound by sound, was because he was disappointed with the state of English orthography. What Hart wanted was an orthography for English that was rational, that was phonemically faithful to speech, and that was composed of letters with a one-to-one relationship to phonemes. But Hart also cared, and cared very deeply, about what the letters actually looked like. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So rather than sounds, I'm going to be talking about type. Over the course of the 3 books that Hart produced as part of his project, we can see Hart adapting his system along both phonological and typographical lines. So all 3 texts that Hart wrote, these are the 3, they were all meant for publication, but only the second 2 were actually printed. In brief, the first 2 are treatises of a couple hundred pages long, the second an expansion and restructuring of the first, and they describe in detail all of the reasons why English orthography is an abuse of the letters, and all of the reason why we have a God-given duty to fix this problem through phonological analysis, and thereby bring rationality and perfection to an otherwise corrupted language. Side note, English in the 16th century is not a prestigious language. The third book is a teaching text that's founded on the same principles. It's much shorter, there's a lot less persuasive rhetoric, and there are a lot more practicalities around how to actually sit down and teach yourself and others this new manner of writing. Now, Hart was hardly alone in thinking that the English language needed some attention. He and others called for a grammar book and a dictionary of English, and over the next 50 years, both calls would be answered for the first time. But in Hart's view, the most urgent issue with English was its orthography. The current writing system, he said, had huge problems. It was in a state of confusion and disorder. It was a dark kind of writing that didn't facilitate literacy. It was, in brief, wrong-shapen for the proportion of the voice, and that pulled down literacy rates across the British Isles. So, how did he plan to fix that? In his first treatise, written in 1551, Hart didn't actually design new letter shapes to be added to the alphabet, although he indicated that that would be the next step. What he focused on instead was the base alphabet that his new letter forms would slot into. And here, Hart is rather unusual in that he didn't only think that there should be just one letter for one sound. He also thought that each letter should have only one graphic form with no variation. So many graphic or orthographic reformers agreed that we should get rid of, say, the long S or the rounded R, which were variant forms of the letters S or R. Its use was dictated by the placement of the letter within a word. So the S longa could not come word finally, the R rotunda could not come word initially, for example. So they weren't simply a different way of writing the same letter. But Hart went a step beyond this. He was disturbed at how the very same letter could in fact look very different across different scripts and different fonts. And as you can see from the examples here pulled from his works, a single letter could look rather different depending on its style or hand. In 16th century England, printers used a variety of typefaces, which you can see here, and there were also a variety of hands that you could use to write English. So secretary hand was the default English hand, but a professional scribe would also be competent in a variety of hands. Here we have Roman, italic, and two different kinds of chancery. And the difference between the hands didn't just come down to style, but to the very letter shapes. And certain hands were associated with different kinds of writing in different languages. So if an English person were to write down a passage in Latin, it was normal to switch from secretary into an italic or humanist hand. To Hart, secretary, black letter, Roman, and italic posed 4 different challenges for the reader and quadrupled the amount of effort needed for basic literacy. What Hart wanted, and again, rather unusual, was an orthography that would be homogeneous across different media. And in his view, the best and most English of these options was secretary hand. He intended to produce his second book entirely in a printed secretary, which he said would be, quote, convenient and speedy for the writing, good for the print, and fair for the sight of the reader. So fast, printable, and pretty. Hart said that by such means, we might wind ourselves out of the manifold and variable hands, which every fantasy doth invent, and out of the barbarous print, which was contrary to any hand used and without good effect or purpose. In other words, we should print like we write in our natural English hand and stop relying on continental imports. After all, Hart goes on to say, in Italy and in Germany, printed letters look just like handwriting, and so there was far less confusion. That is not a factual perspective, but it's a fascinating one. Now, there was a big problem for Hart's plan to unify all English writing, and that was the expense of producing a font for English secretary hand, which did not yet exist and would not exist until after Hart died. Hart acknowledged that this was a very expensive process. He estimated it would cost at most £100, and for context, at the height of Hart's professional career as Chester Herald, his annual pay was just over £14. So he's estimating the cost at 7 times his annual salary. Hart rightly says, I know not any man that would be so zealous to attempt, such a thing, except possibly for his dedicatee, King Edward VI. And Hart's idea was that the king would pay for the font and everyone would use it because the king would tell them to. And it would secure Edward's legacy because he'd forever be the king that brought English to perfection. That did not happen. Hart never printed this manuscript. Edward died. Fast forward to 1569. Hart is now Chester Herald, earning his annual £14, and he revisits this project with more modest ambitions. So you've seen this or these pages before. This is the first spread to be composed entirely in Hart's new orthography. And the first thing we might notice is that this is not secretary hand. This is italic. And Hart's stated reason for that is a little bit evasive. He says there are so many different kinds of secretary hands, and none of them have been made into a font, but we already have italic fonts, and we already write in italic hands, and it's fast and easy, so let's just go with it. Hart does, however, this time actually invest in special sorts. He designs 6 new letters, and he designs those letters specifically so that they can be both written and printed with ease and slotted straight into an italic font that Hart's printer already owned. So this is much more economical than what Hart had originally wanted. Designing a whole font would have required somewhere in the region of 150 individual characters. Hart only needed to pay for 6. And just 6 seems to have been his limit because he didn't even produce capitalized versions, even though he says he would gladly have had letters for the capitals too. But for want of them, he adopts this weird capitalization method wherein he prefaces any word that needs capitalized with a stroke. And because a stroke usually in this period indicates a sentence boundary, he introduces this little squiggle or tilde which sort of stands in for the end of a sentence. Hart says this minuscule alphabet is for the benefit of the reader because it means they don't have to learn any additional letter shapes that capitals might involve. But the capitals that he envisions were simply greater and thicker versions of the same characters. So it seems that the lack of them has a little bit less to do with pedagogy and a little bit more to do with frugality. So it's not perfect. It could be improved, but it's out there. His system is printed and it's printable. And the second half of his treatise, which is again over 100 pages, is printed entirely in his new orthography. In his third book, Hart makes even more of a stride. This time, he only produces 5 special sorts. He's gotten rid of the syllabic L on the grounds that English is not Welsh, so on phonetic lines. These 5 sorts are much larger, and they're meant to fit with a larger font. So this is his alphabet table with pictures to aid with the pronunciation. And here is his system in practice. And on the recto page here, you can see that he still uses his original font as well in the smaller size where it's convenient. So now he has 2 different kinds of fonts to work with. A quick note, though, about the capitals. It's hard to know anything for sure when the only evidence we have is an impression on a page, but I suspect that the capitals are not in fact made from metal type, founded off of a matrix, but are instead individual woodcuts, and that only the so-called lowercase are actually metal type. And I'll just show, when you overlay these 2 F's, which is this letter here on the same page of the Lord's Prayer, the letters don't quite match up, whereas if you do the same for all of the lowercase f's, it's close to perfect. Woodcut is, of course, a great way of printing a letter if you don't need that letter to appear multiple times on the same page. And Hart had, in fact, previously used woodcuts too in his second text from 1569. There, he used 2 woodcuts to demonstrate his typographical thought process behind the letter ch, or ch. So these, attempt 1 and 2, are the forms that he toyed with, but ultimately decided not to use. But he still took on some expense just to feature these 2 rejected candidates. And this, I think, is one of the strongest witnesses to Hart's orthographical and typographical care. He thought through his letter forms carefully, and he had them produced carefully. And throughout his works, he seemed very worried that people wouldn't like his alphabet and very concerned that they would grow to appreciate it. He said again and again, "Give me a try. It may seem, quote, at first very strange, hard, and unprofitable, but with time you'll find it easy and delectable." And to that point, in the end matter, he includes an address to the reader from the compositor, the person who would have put the type in place, which essentially says in English blackletter, which would have been a very legible form, "I was skeptical of this system at first, but now I couldn't possibly go back to traditional orthography. This writing system is amazing." So Hart, like pretty much every orthographic reformer ever, was not successful in his efforts. But that's not to say his efforts were silly or misguided or irrelevant to conversations that we might have today, not just about spelling reform, but about the role of writing more generally. He's an example, I think, of someone who would be very keen on this kind of grapholinguistics conference and on the discussions that we've been having over the last couple of days. But he would bring to this kind of setting a 16th century English perspective on what constitutes a writing system, which is a perspective that challenges us to reconsider some of our assumptions. Hart's ideal writing system was not a system with regular standardized spelling. The fact that the word English could be spelled with an initial E or an I was not even worth comment. That wasn't part of the problem. The problem was when the conventional English spelling strayed from phonetic representation. The problem that there were far too many ways to express a single sound, and that those ways didn't just stop at the prototypical letter, but extended beyond into the category of scripts and fonts. Hart's mission, and the mission of his contemporary counterparts, wasn't to reform English spelling. It was to develop a unified orthography tailored not just to English phonology, but to an English aesthetic and identity. In Hart's view, orthographic reform was the first step towards an improvement of the English language itself. He recognized that a language was exemplified in both its speech and in its writing. And just as a language will have its own sound, so too will it have its own look. And those aesthetic features, arguably those non-linguistic features, will nonetheless meaningfully shape how a linguistic community views itself and how it is in turn perceived by others on the world stage. I'll end it there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Thanks for this very interesting presentation. I wonder, did Hart comment on intellectually interact with his predecessors for Italian, for example, like Pietro Bembo, who basically followed a very similar agenda from what you said, with a similar comprehensive understanding of orthography. A few decades prior to that, and in the case of Bembo, with more success.
Yes. Oh. Great question. He wasn't engaging with his Italian counterparts. He was engaging with the French. And is this? Oh. Okay, thank you. He was aware of one French spelling reformer in particular, and in his second book talks about him quite extensively. But I should say too, Sir Thomas Smith is usually considered the first English spelling reformer because his printed work comes out a year before the first work by Hart that is printed. And even though Hart wrote his manuscript first, Sir Thomas Smith published first. But although Hart was engaging with Sir Thomas Smith as well, he was very assured that his system was better, and that his system was better from all of the people who had come before, including in the continent. He was very proud. Yeah.
I also have a question concerning the letter he invented for the th. So there was already a letter called thorn in Old English. Was he unaware of that? Was it deliberate to avoid this tradition? And the thorn still exists in Icelandic today. So what happened?
Yeah, great question. So he was aware of the thorn. He introduced two letters, one for the voiced th and one for unvoiced. These are not graphically related to the thorn. He makes the specific decision not to turn back to older styles of writing. He wants to create something that will work within the current secretary hand aesthetic, which is why he comes up with these. Other spelling reformers, I think I have pictures here. That's random pictures on printing. So this is Sir Thomas Smith's system, and he does introduce the thorn specifically, and other Anglo-Saxon letter forms, because his project, he is a little bit more scholarly, and he wants his system to sort of reawaken some of the lost traditions of Old English.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering in that last chart you were showing us with the letters that he was, yeah, that one. The Hart's additional letters jump off the page or screen at us as different in style. And I was wondering if that's just because he was imitating he liked secretary hand and he was in a different typographic tradition than we are, or is that inherent to those letters? And I would think it would, if it's inherent to them that would, people wouldn't want to adopt something where that had a sort of inconsistency of look with the background script. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Will this work? Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So in that chart that I had made, deliberately placed those letters alongside Roman type, which he would never have done. This was supposed to be set alongside an italic hand. And I don't know, I suppose it's up to you if you think that that those letters jar. As I say, he is worried that will be your reaction. And the constant encouragement is just give it a try, just start to read and it'll become a lot easier. And I can tell you after 50 pages of reading this kind of writing, it does become fairly easy and the letters don't really stand out more than any other. I would say that the punctuation marks are a lot more prominent. But it was an active concern on his part that it would look unusual, and he knew that would lead to public resistance.
Any other question? Thank you very much.